And actually, in those 2 weeks, used to spend a week, first week speaking, and the second week in silence. I got into these incredibly beautiful spaces, and then one day I was sitting in meditation. And they were normally 45-minute meditations, and I was there. I was one with everything. I'd had the same experience as I'd had with the LSD in the meditation, and I sat. I was completely straight, completely still. Nothing was going on inside me. I thought, that's it. I've cracked it. I'm there. I thought, this is amazing. I'm enlightened. And so, I finished, and people had noticed me as well. I'd obviously sat very, very still, and people had come up to me and said, what's going on? I said, this is it. I've hit it. I've understood the nature of who I was. And then bit by bit over the day, I went through the normal thing we went in the day. And the next morning, I sat down in meditation again, waiting for this experience. Never happened again. Never happened again. In all the years since, I never hit that place of oneness. But the thing about an experience is it can't be taken away from you. A belief is something that gets formed from dogma or whatever you feel you ought to think. I knew in that 45 minutes, in the same way as I knew with the LSD, except this was a much more potent experience because this was me without any external stimulus other than a very profound breathing practice. I knew that I was far more than I dreamed I was.
You were far more than you dreamed you
Yes.
were. So talk to me more about that.
Al-Hallaj, the Sufi saint, was crucified in the 13th century for saying, I am God. I hope I don't get crucified, but in that moment I realised I am God. I am one with everything. I am a part of everything. I am no longer in fear of this. What I grew up with was sort of like this man in the heavens who'd punished me for doing wrong and who I was terrified of. I was a co-creator with God. I was willing to yoke myself to God, willing to serve God, willing to be with that which guides the universe. What a fantastic ambition that became.
So you moved out of the kind of conditioning of Malcolm.
Yes.
And somehow you realised the true you was something beyond that.
Yes. Yes. And it initiated a very big search, and that search still exists to this day. And I've been very fortunate to study with some extraordinary teachers, and I took it for granted at the time, some of these teachers I worked with, that this is how life is. So I worked for about a year and a half. I used to go to a woman called Irina Tweedy, who wrote a book called The Chasm of Fire. Now this woman, when I went to her, was in her 80s, and in her 70s she'd had an enlightenment experience with a Sufi master in the East, and had come back in her 80s teaching, had come back from being a housewife who'd had this extraordinary experience and had come back as a profound teacher. Now I, along with 40, 50 other people on a Friday night, used to go to her house at 6:15, lie on the floor. We didn't have to sit in some fancy position and do some fancy breathing practice. Lay on the floor and had 45 minutes of visions. And so did the other people around the place.
But how, okay, just describe Anita, because I've heard about her, but I've never actually obviously seen her or even see a video of her. So what form did the evenings take?
We'd have come in and have a cup of tea and then lie on the floor for 45 minutes, and nothing would be said at that stage.
Well, you just lay down?
Just lay down, and so did everyone else. We just lay on the floor.
There wasn't something in the tea, was there?
I hope not, no, but I don't think it was. I actually I'm
yeah.
sure it wasn't. But actually there was, in her presence, people had experiences. And I experienced myself as being held in the arms of her guru often, and held and rocked. I experienced myself as being reassured that my path was an appropriate one. It wasn't that I had these visions of sort of like dragons and vampires and werewolves. It was more a vision of oneness, and more a vision of you're on track, more a vision of you're bigger than you think you are.
So did you feel an energy emanating from her?
Yes, there's no question it was emanating from her.
So what did you tangibly feel from her?
I felt that she was a woman who was awakened, and who had actually no longer had very much in the way of egoic goals. That she was actually in service to life, and had given her. Someone had bought her this flat that she was in, and she'd used it for this purpose. And often afterwards, we'd have tea afterwards, and often afterwards she'd be talking to someone, and there'd be 40, 50 people in the room. But when I needed to hear what it was she had to say, it was almost as though she was talking directly to me, without the 40 or 50 other voices that were a hubbub around. Everything went quiet, and I'd hear her voice, and it would be telling me something I needed to know. And this happened fairly constantly, and I thought, oh, that's normal. You go to a spiritual teacher, that's what you get. But of course, she was extremely special, and There are many spiritual teachers who will take you to their own ego needs, or they'll take you to a place of manipulation, but very few will be taking you from a place of, I think, a place of non-attachment to any outcome or any being.
So after the 45 minutes of lying on the floor, you'd all sit up and you'd share your experiences? Is that how it
No,
worked?
we'd sit and have tea and talk about anything.
She would just, you could ask
Everyone would get
her
up, the
things
bell would ring, and you'd get up, and some people would talk to her, some would talk to each
Yeah.
other, you'd just have a chat.
Huh. And you saw her for about an hour and a
About
half,
18 months.
About 18 months,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And I know you also spent some time with Ramdas too.
Yes, Ramdas was a major teacher of mine, and again a very wonderful and compassionate teacher. And Ramdas never said I'm the guru. He always said I'm the servant. You know, his name Ramdas is servant of God. Was very much about service, and it's very much triggered my thinking that for me the Rabindranath Tagore poem, which says I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I woke and found that life was service. I acted, and behold, service was joy. That's every lecture I give, I end with those words, because for me, life is about service. And Ramdas, for me, taught me what service was. A very beautiful and profound teacher who had utter compassion and kindness. And I remember one time there were 40 therapists doing a workshop with him at Grimstone Manor in Devon, and he did a meditation on grief. And there were people lying on the floor sobbing, and there's a few of us sitting there sort of, you know, well, I'm obviously not a sad bastard like all of them, but it's actually, at the end of the meditation, he said, and for those of you who couldn't find that place of grief, that's your grief, that you can't actually go there. And for me, I had to undo a whole lot of my public school training. I had to revisit a lot of my sensitivity, and Ramdas was a wonderful teacher and exponent of that. Spent time exploring with other teachers, people like Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher who was nominated by Martin Luther King for the Nobel Peace Prize for his advocacy of non-violent resistance to the Americans in Vietnam. And I spent time with a guy called Andrew Watson, who was actually a major teacher for me, whose brother Lyle Watson wrote the book Supernature. And Andrew was a healer who'd been a South African farmer who one day had had a visitation and was forced into the place of healing. And he'd walked down the street and seen an old friend of his and grabbed him by the shoulder and done some twisting of his shoulder. He said, "I'm so sorry, I don't know what came over me." And this guy had suddenly moved his arm and said, "My arm's been locked for the last 12 years, you've just freed it." And Andrew was an extraordinary healer, and I spent 3 years studying with him. After I'd done a psychotherapy training, humanistic psychology training, I spent 3 years as Andrew Watson's assistant, and he was another great teacher who'd actually shown me what the healing journey was about.